They mocked me. But my grandson stood up, and nothing was ever the same. There are moments in life that brand themselves into your memory so deeply that no amount of time can erase them. For me, it wasn't a celebration, not a holiday, not even a grand tragedy. It was the sound of laughter, the wrong kind of laughter. The kind that doesn't invite you in, but instead shuts you out. The kind that makes you feel smaller with every echo. I remember that afternoon with a clarity that still chills me. The house was filled with voices, the clinking of dishes from the kitchen, footsteps moving in and out of rooms. But louder than all of it was the sharp sting of words followed by cruel laughter. From where I sat, in the chair by the window that had become my quiet refuge, I could hear them. My daughter-in-law's voice was the first to rise. She thought she was whispering, but her words carried across the walls. "She just sits there," she said with irritation. "She doesn't help. She doesn't do anything. We have to take care of her like she's a child." The words struck like stones, but before I could even process them, my own son added fuel to the fire. "She's useless now," he said flatly, as if stating a fact no one could deny. And then came the sound that broke me in ways I had never imagined: my granddaughter's laugh. "Maybe we should just put her in a home," she said, the cruelty masked as a joke. But it was no less sharp. The three of them laughed together, their voices merging into a chorus that cut deeper than knives. Sat frozen, my hands trembling slightly in my lap. I wanted to stand up, to storm into the kitchen and remind them of every sacrifice I had made, every sleepless night I had endured for their sake, every tear I had wiped from their faces when they were children. But my voice caught in my throat, strangled by disbelief and heartbreak. My chest tightened, my breath came shallow, and I sat motionless, letting their laughter wash over me like waves of acid. They thought I couldn't hear. They thought I was too frail, too absent, too far gone to understand. But I heard every word. I felt every sting. And in that moment, I was no longer the mother or the grandmother. I was the joke. It is one thing to be forgotten. It is another to be mocked. Forgetfulness can be forgiven, but mockery is deliberate. It is an act of erasure. As I stared out of the window, pretending to admire the birds in the yard, my eyes burned with unshaded tears. My body, already weary with age, felt heavier than it ever had before. The house that once held my laughter, my cooking, my warmth, had turned into a stage where I was the punchline. If this story already grips your heart, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Every click helps these stories reach someone who may be sitting in silence, believing they are forgotten. But what none of them knew in that moment was that someone else had been listening too. Someone younger, sharper, with a fire that refused to let injustice slide. My grandson. He had heard it all: the dismissive tone, the cruel laughter, the way they spoke of me as if I were a burden to be cast aside. And unlike me, he did not stay frozen. Unlike me, he refused to stay silent. His voice would become the shield I never knew I still had. And when he stood up, everything in that house changed forever. There was a time when laughter in this house meant joy. I can still hear the echoes of children running down the hallway, their giggles bouncing off the walls. I can still picture myself standing at the stove, stirring a pot of soup, while my son came rushing in hungry from school, calling, "Mom, what's for dinner?" I can still remember my granddaughter sitting on the floor by my rocking chair, playing with her dolls while I told her stories that made her eyes widen with wonder. Back then, laughter meant life. It meant family. It meant belonging. But somewhere along the way, that laughter changed. It twisted into something darker, something cruel. It no longer lifted me up, pinned me down. The first time I noticed the difference, it was so subtle I thought I imagined it. My daughter-in-law corrected me mid-sentence at the dinner table. "No, "That's not how it happened," she said, rolling her eyes as if I were a child who couldn't remember her own life. Everyone laughed politely, and I forced a smile, pretending it didn't sting. But inside, something cracked. I had spent my life being the one who remembered birthdays, anniversaries, favorite meals. I had been the keeper of details, the organizer, the one everyone relied on. And now, suddenly, I was the one being dismissed, as if my words carried no weight. It didn't stop there. My granddaughter, who once hugged me so tightly I thought she'd never let go, began to giggle at my mistakes. If I forgot where I put my glasses, she smirked. If I asked her to repeat something, she whispered a joke to her friends about how grandma's losing it. My son, my own flesh and blood, sat silent through it all. He never told them to stop. He never reminded them of who I was. His silence was worse than their laughter, because silence from someone you love feels like betrayal wrapped in indifference. The house that once felt like mine became a place where I had to measure every word, every step. I stopped telling stories because I didn't want to give them another reason to laugh. I stopped asking questions because I was tired of the sighs and the rolling eyes. Slowly, my voice shrank until I barely recognized it, and that's when the laughter became a prison. Not the joyful laughter of years gone by, but the kind that keeps you chained, reminding you daily that you no longer belong. I used to think maybe I was imagining it, maybe I was being too sensitive. But then there were the meals where plates were set without one for me. The nights when the living room filled with noise and joy, but my door remained closed. I would open it, hoping for an invitation, but no one ever turned their head. They didn't even notice I was there. That's when I realized it wasn't in my mind, it was real. I wasn't part of the family anymore. I was furniture they had grown tired of, something that just took up space. The cruelest part was remembering who I used to be in this same house. I was the matriarch, the voice of reason, the one who decided what would be cooked, who kept the peace when arguments flared. I used to walk these rooms with authority. Now I shuffled quietly, hoping not to disturb the life that continued without me. Every corner whispered reminders of my past strength, and every laugh reminded me of my present weakness. One night, I sat on my bed and thought about all the birthdays I had planned. All the Christmas mornings I had stayed up late to prepare. All the school projects I'd helped finish at the last minute. None of it seemed to matter anymore. They didn't see those sacrifices. They didn't see me. Well, I saw the mistakes, the slowness, the signs of age. And they turned it into a joke. Do you know what it feels like to be erased while you're still alive? It's to sit in a room full of people who share your blood, your history, your name, and realize they don't see you anymore. That's what their laughter did. It stripped me of the right to belong in my own home. And when I looked at them, smiling and joking as if their words didn't pierce me, I realized something I had never admitted before. I was alone even, in the middle of my family. But in that silence, in that ache, I also found something else. A memory, faint but powerful. The memory of being strong, of surviving more than anyone knew. I thought of the nights I worked late shifts to keep the lights on. I thought of the mornings I woke up before dawn to make sure there was food on the table. I thought of how I carried this family on my back when they were too young to carry themselves. And as the laughter from the living room echoed down the hall, I whispered to myself, they may have forgotten. But I haven't. I know who I am. That whisper was not loud enough to stop them. Not yet, but it was enough to remind me that my story wasn't over, no matter how much they wanted to laugh me out of it. Tell me in the comments where you are watching this from. It gives me strength to see how far my voice can travel, even when those closest to me tried to silence it. There comes a point when the small humiliations start to add up, layering themselves one over the other until you feel buried under the weight of them. At first, I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, that perhaps age had made me too sensitive. But deep down, I knew it wasn't my imagination. It was real, and it was deliberate. I can still recall the way my daughter-in-law's eyes narrowed whenever I entered the kitchen. If I reached for a pot, she would sigh as if my touch ruined the order she had created. "Don't bother, I've got it," she'd say, sharply snatching utensils from my hands like I was a clumsy child. Sometimes she didn't even speak. She would just roll her eyes and smirk, and that alone cut deep enough. Every gesture told me I wasn't welcome, not even in the space where I had once ruled with love and discipline. The living room, once the heart of the family, became another battlefield. I'd join them hoping for conversation, only to be drowned out by interruptions. If I shared a memory, someone would laugh and say, "That's not how it happened." If I asked a question, they'd ignore it altogether or change the subject. My granddaughter was the cruelest in her innocence. She laughed at the way I forgot small details, whispering to her friends about how Grandma doesn't know anything anymore. That laugh's sharp. A keen, mocking echoed in my chest long after the sound faded. I had always been the storyteller, the keeper of our family's history. I could recall dates, names, events as if they had just happened. But suddenly, my stories weren't worth listening to. They were interruptions, background noise, excuses for others to giggle. The silence that followed each humiliation was the loudest part of all. They didn't have to say the words outright, every laugh, every sigh. Every dismissive glance screamed what they thought, that I was no longer important. There was one night I'll never forget. We were sitting at the dinner table, the smell of roasted chicken filling the room. I had helped prepare it, but no one mentioned that. Instead, as I tried to pass a plate, my hands trembled slightly. My granddaughter snickered. "Careful, Grandma, don't drop it." The table erupted in laughter, even my son, my own child, laughing at me. I forced a smile, pretending it didn't hurt, but inside I was crumbling. That was the night I realized my silence was not just survival, had become their entertainment. I stopped going into the living room after that. I stayed in my room where the walls didn't mock me, where the shadows didn't laugh. But even in my retreat, I felt their words chasing me, echoing in my ears. "She's useless. She's slow. She doesn't belong here anymore." Those weren't just words, carving away at my dignity, piece by piece, until I hardly recognized myself. Yet, even as I withdrew, my mind wandered to the past. I remembered the nights I stayed awake with my son when he was sick, rocking him gently until his fever broke. I remembered the afternoons when I braided my granddaughter's hair while she told me about her dreams of becoming a dancer. I remembered birthdays, graduations, family gatherings, where my hands had cooked every dish and my arms had embraced every soul in that house. Those memories were proof of who I was, but now they felt like ghosts haunting me. The cruelest part wasn't the words themselves. It was the fact that no one defended me. My son, who owed his life to my sacrifices, stayed silent. He let the laughter echo. He let the pile up. His silence spoke louder than their words. It told me he agreed, that in his eyes too, I had become nothing more than a burden. That betrayal stung more than anything my daughter-in-law or granddaughter could have said. I began to shrink into myself. I walked softer, spoke less, made myself smaller in every way possible. I thought maybe if I became invisible, they would stop mocking me. But invisibility only gave them more reason to laugh. This doesn't even say anything anymore. I heard one of them whisper one evening. I wanted to scream, to tell them that my silence wasn't weakness, it was survival. But the scream never came. Only the tears I refused to let fall in front of them. And so the humiliations carved me into silence. Not the kind of silence that comes from peace, but the kind that is forced upon you, heavy and suffocating. It was a silence filled with swallowed words, choked back tears, and memories of who I used to be. a silence that made me wonder if I even existed in their eyes anymore. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It reminds me that even when those closest try to erase us, there are still people out there who choose to listen, who choose to see. It is one thing to feel invisible, to sense that the people you love no longer see you. But it is another thing entirely to hear it spoken aloud, to hear their cruelty laid bare without shame. That night will never leave me, no matter how many years I live. I had gone to bed early, or at least they thought I had. My room was dark, the old clock ticking softly on the nightstand, but sleep would not come. My chest was heavy, my mind restless, so I rose quietly and walked down the hall to fetch the glasses I had left in the living room. I moved slowly, my steps soft against the carpet, not wanting to disturb anyone. That was when I heard them. Their voices were hushed, but not enough. My daughter-in-law's voice was sharp, impatient. She's taking up too much space. I can't keep doing this. Michael, something has to change. My son sighed heavily and answered, I know, but what do you want me to do? The next words sliced through me like a blade. Maybe it's time for a home. Somewhere far, somewhere permanent. We could sell this house, split the money, finally breathe a little. I froze in the hallway, my hand pressed against the wall to steady myself. My knees trembled, and suddenly the corridor felt like it was spinning. The walls closed in, and I clutched at the wallpaper as if it could hold me together. They wanted me gone, not just mocked, not just ignored, but gone. Out of the house I had filled with my love, my labor, my very life. Out of the rooms where I had once rocked my son to sleep, cooked meals with care, and whispered prayers for their future. And then, as if that wasn't enough, I heard my granddaughter laugh. She doesn't even know what day it is half the time. Old people like her don't need big houses. She can knit in some small room with a view and call it retirement. The cruelty in her laughter wasn't masked this time. It was raw, careless, as though my entire existence was nothing more than an inconvenience. My chest tightened, my breath caught. I wanted to cry out, to rush into that room and scream, How dare you? How dare you speak of me this way after everything I have given? But my voice betrayed me, stayed locked inside, buried under years of holding back, years of swallowing pain. Instead, I staggered back to my room, my vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the pattern in the carpet, the voices still echoing in my ears. Useless, burden, problem to be solved. In that moment, something inside me shattered. It wasn't just my heart, it was my identity. For decades, I had been the one who carried them. It's the one who stayed awake with sick children, who stretched pennies to feed a family, who sacrificed dreams so they could chase theirs. And now, after all of it, they saw me as nothing more than a weight, dragging them down. My sacrifices had become invisible, my love irrelevant. I thought of my late husband then, his voice warm and steady, always reminding me that I was the heart of the family. They'll never forget what you've done, he used to say. But he was wrong. They had forgotten. Or maybe they never saw it in the first place. And the cruel irony was that I was still alive to witness my own erasure. That night, the house that had once been my kingdom became a stranger's place. Every picture on the wall felt like a lie. Every piece of furniture carried memories that mocked me now. The laughter I once cherished had turned into a weapon. And I sat there, broken, realizing that I was no longer a part of their world. I was just in the way of it. But then, as I sat in silence, I heard a knock on my door. Soft, hesitant, my grandson's voice barely above a whisper. Grandma? I didn't answer at first. I couldn't. My throat was tight, my lips trembling. He opened the door slowly, stepping inside with eyes full of something I hadn't seen in a long time, anger. But not the careless kind. It was protective, burning, righteous. I heard them, he said quietly. I didn't mean to, but I heard everything. I looked up, my tears spilling now, unable to hide them. He came closer, knelt in front of me, and took my hand in his. They can't do that to you. This is your home. You're not going anywhere. His voice cracked as he spoke, but his grip was steady. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt seen, truly seen. At that moment, I realized something powerful. I had been mocked, dismissed, humiliated. But not everyone was blind. Not everyone had forgotten. My grandson stood where no one else dared to stand, and in his eyes, I saw the reflection of the woman I used to be, the strong one, the keeper, the foundation. His voice became my shield, his presence my reminder that I was not alone. That night, as the rest of the house laughed and plotted, he stayed beside me in silence. Not the cruel silence of dismissal, but the comforting silence of someone who refuses to leave. And in that silence, something inside me shifted again. What had been shattered began, piece by fragile piece, to gather itself back together. Tell me in the comments, have you ever overheard words that broke you? Words not meant for your ears, but that changed everything. Share your story, because sometimes the truth we hear in the shadows is the one that sets us free. There are moments in life when silence becomes unbearable, when the weight of unspoken words crushes you more than any insult ever could. That night, after hearing them plan to send me away, I thought I had lost everything. My dignity, my family, my home, it all felt like it was slipping through my fingers. I sat on the edge of my bed, the darkness wrapping around me like a cloak, my chest tight with a pain too heavy to carry. But then came my grandson, and with him, a light I had almost forgotten existed. He sat beside me quietly at first, his young face hardened in a way that startled me. He wasn't supposed to carry anger like that, not at his age. But life has a way of turning innocence into strength when injustice is too loud to ignore. "They don't see you, Grandma," he said softly, "but I do. I always have." His words sliced through the silence, through the weight pressing down on me. I looked at him, searching his eyes for pity, but there was none. What I found instead was fire. The next morning, the house was alive with chatter. My daughter-in-law bustled around the kitchen, my granddaughter laughed on the phone, and my son flipped through the mail as if nothing had happened. I moved through the rooms quietly, carrying the ache of the night before, but my grandson stayed close. His eyes never left me, and I could feel something stirring inside him, something waiting for the right moment. It came sooner than I expected. Sat at the dinner table, the air thick with unspoken tension. I reached for the serving spoon, my hands trembling just slightly, and my granddaughter smirked. "Careful, Grandma," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "Don't spill it this time." The laughter that followed was sharp, cutting, merciless. I froze, my throat tightening, tears burning behind my eyes. It was the same cycle again, the mockery, the silence, the erasure. But this time, something was different. My grandson pushed back his chair, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. The sound silenced the table, all eyes turning toward him. His voice, steady but trembling with restrained anger, broke the room in two. "Enough," he said. "Do you even hear yourselves? Do you realize how cruel you sound? This is my grandmother, the woman who raised my father, who built this home, who gave everything for this family. And you sit here laughing at her as if she's nothing?" The room froze. My son shifted uncomfortably. My daughter-in-law's face tightened, and my granddaughter rolled her eyes. But my grandson didn't stop. He stood taller, his voice gaining strength with every word. "You think she's useless? Without her, none of us would even be here. You think she's a burden? She carried all of you when you were too weak to carry yourselves, and you dare to laugh. Shame on you." His words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. impossible to ignore. For the first time, their laughter was silenced not by me, but by him. And in that silence, I felt something shift. The walls that had closed in around me seemed to widen. The weight that had pressed me into silence began to lift, because he saw me. He defended me. He gave me back the dignity they had tried to steal. I looked at him, my heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride because he had the courage I had lost. Sorrow because he should never have had to carry it. He was just a boy. Yet in that moment he was more of a man than anyone else at that table. My son cleared his throat, muttering something about respect and keeping the peace, but his words were hollow. My daughter-in-law pretended to busy herself with the dishes, her hands trembling slightly. My granddaughter avoided my gaze, her smirk gone. They had been called out, and though they would never admit it, they felt the sting. That night, when the house grew quiet again, my grandson came to my room. He didn't knock this time. He simply walked in, sat down, and took my hand. "Don't ever believe them," he whispered. "You're not a burden. You're the reason we're all here. And I won't let them take that from you." His voice cracked, but his grip was firm. And in his words, I found something I thought I had lost forever: hope. For years, I had carried this family. I had been the silent force holding everything together. But in that moment, I realized something new. Sometimes the torch doesn't pass with ceremony or speeches. Sometimes it passes quietly, in a boy's voice, when he refuses to let the truth be buried. That dinner, that stand he took, became the moment everything changed. Not because they suddenly loved me again, not because the laughter stopped forever, but because I remembered who I was. Through his eyes, I saw my worth reflected back at me, unshakable, undeniable. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had someone stand up for you when no one else would? I want to know where you're watching from, because every story of courage reminds me that no voice, no matter how small, is ever truly alone. The morning after my grandson stood up for me felt different, though nothing in the house had physically changed. The walls were still the same dull beige, the furniture still sat where it always had, and the same clock ticked endlessly on the wall. But the air was different. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something stirring inside me, a quiet strength, fragile but alive. My grandson's words had not only silenced their cruelty for a moment. They had planted a seed in me, a reminder that I was still here, still breathing, still someone worth defending. The rest of the family moved through their routines almost as if nothing had happened. My daughter-in-law banged pots in the kitchen, her lips pursed tighter than usual. My granddaughter scrolled on her phone, glancing at me once or twice with a flicker of discomfort she couldn't quite hide. And my son, my own flesh and blood, voided my eyes entirely. He sat at the table with his newspaper as if burying his head in headlines could erase the truth that had been spoken the night before. But my grandson didn't avoid me. He hovered near, checking on me quietly, sliding me an extra piece of toast, pulling out my chair before I sat down. These small gestures, ones no one else even noticed, were louder than any words. They reminded me that love doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's in the simple, quiet acts of someone who sees you, when others choose to look away. Later that afternoon, the shift became undeniable. I was in the living room, my hands folded in my lap, when my granddaughter walked in. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering between me and her phone. Then, with a forced casualness, she said, "Do you want to watch something with me?" The words were awkward, unnatural, like they didn't belong in her mouth. But still, they were words I hadn't heard in too long an invitation. I nodded, though my heart ached. With the memory of all the nights I had sat alone while laughter spilled from the same room. She put on some show I didn't understand, her eyes glued to the screen, but every now and then she'd glance at me. I think she wanted to erase the sting of her own laughter from the night before. My daughter-in-law was less subtle. That evening, as she cleared the dishes, she muttered, "You shouldn't let the boy talk to us like that. He doesn't know what he's saying." I wanted to shrink again, to let the old silence take over. But something in me, my grandson had reawakened, rose to the surface. I lifted my chin and said softly but firmly, "No, he knows exactly what he's saying. He sees what you refuse to." Her hands froze mid-wash, her face stiffened, but she said nothing more. For the first time, I had spoken back. And it felt like breathing fresh air after years in a closed room. But the moment that truly changed everything came later that night. My son entered my room, the door creaking softly. He didn't look me in the eye. He stood there, shifting awkwardly, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "Mom," he said finally, his voice low. "The boy shouldn't have spoken to us that way." But he hesitated, his voice breaking slightly. But maybe he was right. I stared at him, my breath caught in my throat. For years, I had waited for him to see me again, to remember the woman who had raised him, loved him, carried him through every hardship. And in that moment, I saw a crack in the wall he had built between us. Just a crack, but enough for light to seep through. It didn't erase the pain. It didn't undo the nights of mockery or the cruel words I had overheard. But it was something, a recognition. And for me, it was enough to keep standing. It's enough to remind me that even in the face of betrayal, truth has a way of breaking through. The following days were not perfect. My daughter-in-law still looked at me with impatience. My granddaughter still whispered things she thought I couldn't hear. But the difference was that I no longer sat in silence. My grandson's courage had given me my voice back, even if it shook when I used it. I started speaking up again slowly, carefully. If they interrupted, I repeated myself. If they mocked me, I looked them in the eye. And though they may not have admitted it, I could feel it. They were unsettled, because the woman they thought they had erased was still here. And she wasn't going anywhere. And then there was my grandson. He became my shadow, my ally, my reminder of what love looks like when it's pure and unselfish. He didn't always speak, but he didn't have to. His presence was enough. He sat with me in the evenings, told me about his dreams for the future, about how he wanted to fight for people who didn't have a voice. "Like you," he'd say, "because you're the strongest person I know." Those words healed wounds that had been festering for years. They reminded me that no matter how much others tried to strip away my worth, my legacy lived on in him. Not in the mocking laughter of those who had forgotten, but in the fire of the one who remembered. That was the day everything changed, not because the house suddenly filled with love again, but because I remembered that my worth was never theirs to decide. They could mock me, dismiss me, even try to erase me. But they could not take away the truth of who I was. And now that truth had a witness, a protector, a grandson who refused to stay silent. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Knowing how far these stories travel fills me with hope that no matter how forgotten we feel, someone out there still listens, still cares, still believes we matter. Strength doesn't always arrive with trumpets or applause. Sometimes it comes quietly, like a whisper that refuses to fade, a small flame that refuses to go out. For so long I had lived in silence, letting their words weigh me down until I believed them. I had convinced myself that I was fading, that I had become what they said I was, a burden, useless, invisible. But after my grandson stood for me, after he refused to let their cruelty go unchecked, I began to feel something stir inside me. A strength I thought I had lost began to return, not all at once, but piece by piece, breath by breath. I remember the first time I noticed the difference. It was in the kitchen. My daughter-in-law corrected me sharply when I mispronounced a word, her tone dripping with superiority. Normally, I would have shrunk, lowered my eyes, and stayed quiet. But that day, I lifted my head and repeated the words slowly, clearly, refusing to let her silence me. The room went still for a moment, her face flushed with irritation, but I didn't care. For the first time in years, I had claimed my right to be heard. That small act felt monumental, like reclaiming a piece of myself they had stolen. From there, small changes kept happening. At dinner, I began to speak again. Not much at first, but enough to remind them I had a voice. When they interrupted, I waited and then finished what I was saying. When they rolled their eyes, I held their gaze instead of looking away. And the more I did it, the stronger I felt. Not because their behavior changed often, it didn't, but because I no longer accepted their treatment as truth. I had spent too long letting their opinions define my worth. Now I realized their mockery was not a reflection of me, but of them. My grandson noticed these shifts more than anyone. One evening, he came into my room with a smile and said, "Grandma, you're different lately. Stronger." His words filled me with warmth. I told him I had forgotten who I was. "But you reminded me." He shook his head and replied, "No, you were always strong. You just needed someone to remind you to stand tall again." His belief in me became the anchor I leaned on, the mirror that showed me a version of myself I had buried under years of hurt. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about reclaiming the pieces of myself that I had allowed them to strip away. The woman who once ran a household, who once gave advice that others clung to, who once filled rooms with laughter and warmth, she was still here. She hadn't vanished. She had only been silenced. And now, with every small act of courage, I was bringing her back. One evening, I sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was cool, the sky painted in streaks of gold and violet. My grandson joined me, and we sat in silence, the comfortable kind that heals instead of hurts. He leaned his head against my shoulder and whispered, "They'll never understand your strength." "But I do." Tears filled my eyes, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of recognition, of gratitude, of a love so profound it mended wounds I thought would never heal. Inside the house, the laughter of my son and his family floated faintly through the windows. It no longer pierced me the way it once had. Because now I understood, their laughter could not erase me. Their words could not define me. I had given too much, endured too much, loved too deeply to let them rewrite my story. My worth was not up for debate. My life was not theirs to measure, and slowly, I began to carry myself differently. I walked taller. I spoke louder. I looked them in the eye without flinching. They noticed, of course. My daughter-in-law grew sharper in her remarks. My granddaughter quieter in her mockery. And my son more hesitant in his words. But none of it mattered the way it once had. Their reactions no longer dictated my sense of self, because my strength had returned, and once it came back, it refused to leave again. I realized something profound in those days. Strength isn't about never being broken. It's about finding the courage to piece yourself back together after others have tried to tear you apart. It's about choosing to rise even when no one else claps for you. And most of all, it's about recognizing that sometimes the ones who mock us are only revealing their own weakness. My grandson's presence remained my greatest gift. He reminded me daily that love is not inherited by blood. Alone it is proven in action. In loyalty, in the willingness to stand beside someone when the world tries to erase them. He became the living proof that no cruelty could strip me of my legacy. Because my legacy was alive in him, in his fire, in his courage, in his refusal to let me disappear. That was my new strength, not the silence I had once mistaken for survival, but the voice I had reclaimed, the dignity I had rebuilt, and the love that refused to abandon me. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching this story from? Your words remind me that voices can travel far beyond walls of cruelty, and that every story shared has the power to ignite strength in someone else's life. Faith, I have learned, is not always about standing in a church pew or reciting prayers out loud. Sometimes faith is the quiet belief that even in the darkest of nights, the sun will rise again. For a long time, I forgot what that felt like. The weight of rejection had pushed me into silence, and I believed the cruelest lie anyone can believe, that my worth had expired, that my voice no longer mattered, that my story had reached its end. But when my grandson refused to let me fade into invisibility, when he stood in a room full of voices and declared my value without hesitation, something inside me woke up again. It was faith. It was hope. It was the reminder that I was still alive, still breathing, still capable of being seen. Strength does not roar, not always. It doesn't always come wrapped in victory or crowned with applause. More often, it comes in whispers, in tears that dry on your cheeks, in hands that tremble but still rise to wipe them away. My strength came back to me when I chose to stop measuring myself by the eyes of those who mocked me. I found it again when I looked at my grandson and realized that love had not abandoned me. And in that realization, I found a new kind of faith. Not faith in perfection, not faith in the people who had failed me, but faith in the truth that what is rooted in love cannot be erased by cruelty. Every insult I endured, every laugh that rang at my expense, every dismissive glance, none of it had the final word, because the final word belongs to love. The final word belongs to truth, and truth will always outlast lies. For so long, I thought silence was my shield, but I was wrong. My shield was the dignity God placed inside me, a dignity that cannot be taken by anyone unless I surrender it. And I have stopped surrendering. I often sit quietly now, not because I am silenced, but because my silence is chosen. It is the silence of peace, not of fear. When I close my eyes, I remember the woman I once was, the mother who worked tirelessly, the grandmother who cooked with love, the wife who stood faithfully beside her husband until his last breath. That woman never disappeared. She was only buried under years of disregard. And little by little, with the courage of one young voice, she rose again. There is something holy in that, something divine in the way brokenness can transform into strength. Perhaps this is what faith really is, not the absence of pain, but the decision to keep walking even with the scars. Not the absence of betrayal, but the refusal to let betrayal define you. Not the absence of loneliness, but the deep knowing that even if everyone turns their back, one act of love can remind you that you still matter. I carry my scars proudly now. They are no longer marks of shame, but proof of survival, proof that I endured, proof that God's hand never truly left me. I understand now that every tear I shed watered the soil for a new strength to grow. And though the people who hurt me may never admit their cruelty, their power over me has ended. Because strength reclaimed is a fortress, and faith rediscovered is a flame that cannot be extinguished. My grandson reminded me of something priceless, that love is not inherited by blood alone, but by choice. He chose to see me. He chose to defend me. He chose to honor what others dismissed. That choice became my salvation. And in his choice, I see a reflection of divine love, the kind that steps in when the world turns away, the kind that heals without demanding, the kind that whispers, "You are not forgotten." So if you are listening to this and you have ever felt mocked, erased, dismissed, I want you to know your story is not over. Your worth is not negotiable. The world may try to measure you by what you can no longer do, but God measures you by what you have already given, by the love you have planted, by the legacy you carry. Do not let their laughter drown out your truth. Do not let their cruelty erase your name. You are still here. You are still seen. and your life still has chapters left to be written. I rise now, not because everything around me has changed, but because I have changed. I walk with a new strength, a strength rooted in faith, carried by love and ignited by the refusal to be erased. And I know that this is only the beginning. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories of resilience and truth travel farther, reaching those who need to hear that they are not alone. And don't miss the next video. We will uncover a story even more powerful, one where a hidden truth comes to light after decades of silence. What is revealed will leave you breathless.